The Canadian Liberal Party, which just a few months ago was at risk of losing official party status in the upcoming election, has been revived. Not by an inspiring politician with a bold vision or a protege of longtime Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, but by Mark Carney, a pretty boring economist whose history in government is tied as closely to Stephen Harper than it is to the Liberals. Carney's fans say that he's a brilliant economist who's navigated two central banks through two unique crises. His critics say that he's a walking conflict of interest, who doesn't care about Canada, but only about his corporate friends. So who is Carney? What does he believe in? And do his allegiances lie with Canadians or corporations? Carney is a man of many firsts. He's the first Prime Minister born in the Territories, the first person to be the chair of a central bank on two continents, the first Prime Minister to have never held public office. The list goes on. Carney was raised in Edmonton, then went on to study at Harvard, then Oxford, eventually gaining a doctorate in economics. After university, Carney spent 13 years with Goldman Sachs before becoming Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, then Deputy Minister in the Department of Finance before being appointed as the Governor of the Bank of Canada in late 2007 by Stephen Harper. Carney formally took over the position in 2008, just in time for the 2008 financial crisis to hit. Navigating this crisis has been Carney's greatest calling card throughout his career and Liberal leadership campaign. But doubt has been cast on how much of a role he actually played in helping Canada navigate the crisis. Stephen Harper has criticized Carney, saying that Carney is taking credit for the work of Finance Minister Jim Flaherty, saying, quote, "I have listened with increased disbelief to Mark Carney's attempts to take credit for things he had little or nothing to do with back then," end quote. Harper goes on to say that the hard calls during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis were made by Jim. Carney's campaign responded by saying that this was revisionist history, designed to save Poilievre from a historic drop in support. Luckily, the financial crisis was a big deal, and we have receipts. So we can objectively look at how Canada weathered the 2008 crisis better than almost any G7 nation and see who was telling the truth. It's true that Jim Flaherty made some difficult and important decisions during the crisis. His most impactful decision was getting the Canadian government to buy $69 billion worth of insured mortgages, which added no risk to taxpayers since they were insured, allowed financial institutions to keep lending at low rates since the government owned so many of their loans, and even made the government a bit of money. Carney became governor of the Bank of Canada in February of 2008. In March, he cut the overnight interest rate by 50 basis points, predicting that the volatility going on in the States would spread globally. This was not a common choice. The Central Bank of Europe raised interest rates in July. Carney's accurate prediction increased liquidity and borrowing power leading into the crisis. As the crisis got worse, central banks around the world lowered interest rates to their lowest possible level. Carney did something unconventional, which was to guarantee that interest rate for at least a year. This allowed for some stability in the market as consumers and businesses knew what to expect. Carney was praised at the time and in the coming years for these decisions. There are also anecdotal reports that Carney, Flaherty, and Harper were close and liked working together, and that Harper later tried to get Carney to be his Minister of Finance. The truth is, the real reasons behind why Canada navigated the crisis so well are much more complicated than these two men, but that both of them did more than just be competent at their jobs. They excelled and made important and sometimes risky decisions that helped Canada. Harper and the Conservatives have tried to politicize this time to discredit Carney, while Carney has sometimes exaggerated just how much impact the Governor of the Bank of Canada can actually have in order to make himself look good. Carney stayed on as the Governor of the Bank of Canada until he was headhunted to lead the Bank of England in 2013, becoming the first non-Briton to hold the position. Carney was still governor in 2016 when Brexit occurred. He cut interest rates and became a much more public figure than previous Bank of England governors had been, in order to project stability, moves that he once again was praised for. Poilievre has claimed that Carney presided over the Bank of England during a time of massive inflation. However, that inflation came during COVID, as it did worldwide, and happened after Carney had left the position. Most of the criticisms around Carney come from 2020 onward, after he left the Bank of England, and primarily surround his time as the chair of Brookfield Asset Management. Brookfield is a Canadian-American investment company. They're one of the biggest companies in Canada and manage hundreds of billions of dollars. After one of the Liberal leadership debates, Carney was asked about his role in the relocation of Brookfield's headquarters from Toronto to New York City. Carney said that the decision happened after he was no longer chair of the board. That is true on a technicality, but not actually true. Carney left Brookfield in January 2025 to pursue the Liberal leadership. The official sign-off of shareholders on the headquarters move happened in February 2025. But Brookfield had been contemplating the move since at least September 2024, and a memo sent to shareholders in October 2024 confirmed that the move was happening. In my opinion, it is undeniable that Carney knew about the move and had approved it, but tried to deny being involved by using a technicality. Now the question is this a scandal? And I think it's hard to say. First of all, the headquarter move is probably not what you're thinking. Brookfield already had offices in Toronto and New York. Their New York office is bigger, their US business has more assets, employees, and shareholders, and most of their shares are traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The move was technical, to allow the company better access to the US Stock Exchange. Apparently, the move didn't cause the loss of any Canadian jobs or business, or require any Canadian workers to move. Whether or not that remains the case, we will have to see. This minor scandal highlights the ways in which Carney represents somewhat uncharted waters for Canadians. We've never really had a candidate for Prime Minister who has spent so much time so recently working in the private sector. As a private individual working for a private company, Carney's obligation is to the health of that company. The decision to move Brookfield's headquarters is what was best for Brookfield. But as a politician, we expect Carney to do everything he can to keep jobs and businesses in Canada. What makes this a bit more complicated is that Carney was recruited by the Trudeau government in September 2024 to be the chair of the Liberal Party's Task Force on Economic Growth. Because Carney was technically working for the Liberal Party and not the Government of Canada, he didn't have to leave his position at Brookfield or declare any conflicts of interest. The task force never really had time to accomplish anything. After all, Carney left in January to pursue the leadership. But Carney was technically employed by the Liberals while presiding over the relocation of a Canadian company's headquarters to the US. Make of that what you will. One final piece of clarification, Brookfield Corp., the parent company of Brookfield Asset Management, is still based in Toronto. There are a number of other things about Brookfield that will likely come up during the campaign. Brookfield was investigated in 2023 for tax evasion. Everything they did was legal, but they used a lot of offshore companies to exploit Canadian tax loopholes. Brookfield has also been accused of prioritizing renewable projects in Canada while building pipelines in other countries. But between his statement on Brookfield, a previous false statement he had to retract in 2021 where he claimed Brookfield's $600 billion portfolio was carbon neutral, and another vague statement he made about working with Paul Martin on balancing the budget, Carney clearly has an issue with making statements that come back to bite him. You can read this a couple ways. Either Carney simply lacks the media training that a career politician would have and keeps putting his foot in his mouth, or Carney has a bit of a sense of grandeur and likes to fudge the truth when it suits him. Both interpretations could be damaging in a political campaign. Carney has also been criticized by both the NDP and Conservatives for having conflicts of interest tied to his extensive time in the private sector and his many investments. In response to this, Carney put all of his investments, except his personal real estate, in a blind trust ahead of becoming Prime Minister. But Poilievre says that's not enough, and that Carney has found a loophole in the conflict of interest laws that he's using to his advantage. That loophole, that Carney has found a way to wait to divest his assets until 120 days after becoming Prime Minister. Except that's not a loophole. That's literally what the Conflict of Interest Act says. The Act says that people assuming public office have to submit a confidential report to the Ethics Commissioner detailing their financial holdings within 60 days of taking office, but then have 120 days to divest those assets. Now, where Poilievre does have a point is that just because Carney is following the rules doesn't necessarily mean that the rules are sufficient to prevent a conflict of interest. This is true in two ways here. The first is that current conflict of interest laws don't require that leadership candidates disclose their financial connections. That has meant that throughout Carney's leadership bid, he did not have to disclose any potential conflicts of interest or divest himself of those assets until after he won the leadership and became Prime Minister. The second is that a blind trust is an acceptable way of following the rules, but blind trusts remain problematic. The idea of a blind trust is that Carney has to put all of his assets into a trust that will be managed by a third party who needs to have appropriate distance from Carney so Carney can't influence their decisions. That means that theoretically, Carney does not know what decisions have been made in regards to the assets in that trust. But Carney still knows what he put in that trust. So for example, if I have assets connected to a specific company or industry in a blind trust, and I become prime minister, theoretically I could still manipulate the market or pass laws that benefit that particular company or industry. This is certainly not saying Carney will do that, or that his assets constitute a conflict of interest. But it is to say that the possibility remains. The thing is, Carney is following the rules and cooperating with the ethics commissioner, so if a conflict of interest remains, it more so highlights how our conflict of interest laws may not be robust enough. So we get a sense of where Carney has come from, some of his major accomplishments and some of his faults. But I want to talk about the thing that should matter in an election: policy. What does Carney intend to do? Carney plans to reduce or remove interprovincial trade barriers, expedite major infrastructure projects, and greatly reduce delays and red tape around all kinds of construction. All things that every leader is promising, which require heavy cooperation from provinces and municipalities, something that has been very challenging for previous governments to accomplish, but are clearly national priorities. Where Carney's plan may not hold up to scrutiny is in his talk about the budget. Carney promises to balance the budget in 3 years by capping the size of the public service and making the government more efficient through AI and technology. Anyone who has interacted with the Government of Canada knows that technologically it's stuck in the early 2000s, but that's still a tall order. Carney intends new investments in major infrastructure projects, in meeting NATO's 2% defense spending target by 2030, investing $80 billion a year to achieve net zero by 2050, reduce income tax, get rid of the consumer carbon tax and instead implement a green incentive program, and stop the increase to the capital gains tax, invest in accelerated training for skilled workers and apprenticeships, among other things. All of those cost money. And Carney talks a big game about small public investment in order to incentivize heavy private investment. And maybe he can pull it off, but it is reminiscent of when Justin Trudeau first ran and promised increased investment with a deficit for a few years in order to increase economic growth and eventually balance the budget. Carney is certainly a smarter economist than Trudeau, but there's a good chance here that Carney is promising more than he could deliver. Carney removed the consumer carbon tax on his first day as Prime Minister, ending the highly controversial program. His critics have said Carney plans to hide a consumer carbon tax under another name, but his plan appears to be to instead offer a green incentive program, giving rebates to individuals who make greener purchases. Carney's platform is ambitious and will be difficult to achieve, but he brings an interesting philosophy to economic policy in Canada. Trudeau's government struggled economically. Some of that was their fault and some was a series of once-in-a-lifetime crises that happened one after another. But they took a hard stance on many social issues. You can call it virtue signaling if you like, but the Trudeau government put a lot of public funds into certain programs, their flagship being $10 a day daycare. Carney seems to hold the same values at heart but comes at it from a different perspective. He seems to believe that the way to achieve affordable housing, a greener society, economic equality, a safer country, and a thriving economy is to incentivize the private sector to make those choices. This may be the fundamental difference between him and Poilievre, one that is exemplified in a quote from Carney during his first speech as Liberal leader.
Let me tell you something else that we know that Pierre Poilievre doesn't. We know that markets don't have values, people do. And we know as Liberals that it's our job to make markets, to make the economy work for all Canadians. And when the private sector, when the markets are governed well, they deliver great jobs and stronger growth faster than anything. But markets are also indifferent to human suffering, and they are blind to our greatest needs. So when they're not governed well, or not at all, they will deliver enormous wealth for the lucky few and hard times for the rest.
As with Poilievre, many of the problems that Carney seeks to fix are ones that require the provinces to work together and make big changes, while many Canadian provinces have adopted an attitude of contrarianism toward the federal government, especially a Liberal one. And the private sector will always choose that which is most profitable, which up until this point has not coincided with a Liberal government's social priorities, or, as Carney knows firsthand, often hasn't even coincided with staying in Canada. Carney, who has no experience as an elected official, may soon find that achieving a bold vision in Canadian politics is far more difficult and complicated than doing it in the boardroom. But as the showdown is set between Carney and Poilievre, the Conservatives have plenty of ammo to use against Carney. From his tendency to not tell the whole truth, to his corporate history, which they can use to paint him as an elite, to his explicit connection with Trudeau's government, and finally, the fact that he's just kind of boring and sometimes has difficulty connecting with viewers in a public setting. In these strange times, Canadians are looking to be inspired and led with confidence. Can Carney use his extensive experience to convince Canadians he has a clear vision for the future and can stand up to the threats of Trump and other global adversaries? Or will the Conservative attacks be enough to cast doubt on who he is and if he's fit to lead? Or if he's just another flavor of Justin Trudeau in a slightly different package?